Once again, huge thanks to the folks who give at patreon.com/queersplaining. Thank you, and I love you. Folks who give there get each episode early and get access to loads of extra content that you can't find anywhere else. Check out patreon.com/queersplaining for more info. Another quick announcement, the American Atheist Convention is coming to my hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio, April 19th through 21st. Lots of cool speakers, lots of friends, and I plan on doing lots and lots of hugging. I'm going to be there with microphone in hand, talking to people about whether or not atheist activism still makes sense to focus on if you're a person who's primarily concerned about social justice. It's going to be a good time, and if you're able, you should totally check it out. Go to atheists.org for more info and get your tickets. Now on to the show, which I will give you a heads up contains references to, but not descriptions of, sexual assault, and a few stories of queer and trans folks' interaction with the criminal justice system that don't go particularly well. Please take care of yourselves. Sometimes all it takes is a phone call to change your life. It sounds like a clickbaity headline, but sometimes it's also literally true. A few days ago, my friend Maddie of the Minnesota Trans Atheist podcast introduced me to Shanna Felix. She's a criminal justice PhD student, and her studies focus on queer and trans issues. But she went into college with a plan that looked very, very different.
When I was a teenager, 18 years old, the first thing I did was go to college right after high school. And I had a pretty traumatic childhood between my parents and relationships and whatnot. So I had this idea that I wanted to help people. So I always wanted to be a therapist. So I went to school to study psychology. My life was all planned out. I was 18 years old, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I was like, I'm going to go straight to grad school. I'm going to pursue a degree, a PhD in clinical therapy, and that's just what I'm going to do. While I was an undergrad, everything that I did was with that specific goal in mind. So I started volunteering for the Rape Crisis Center, not because I had any kind of experience with sexual violence or anything like that. It was literally because I thought it would help me in this dream to become a therapist. Well, like a lot of people who go into college with this big plan, it changes really fast. I saw my own therapist and I worked out some of the problems that I had, and I realized I don't really want to be a therapist. But that had been part of my identity for so long that I didn't really know what to do anymore. So I changed my major over and over again. I was like, I'll be a brain surgeon. Biology classes are really hard, so that didn't happen. Then I was like, I hate people. I'll just be a computer scientist. I didn't really like the computer science classes. So I was like, well, I like to think, so I'll study philosophy. And I thought the only thing that's less marketable than a psychology bachelor's degree is a philosophy bachelor. No offense to anybody who would have that, but I was like, and I don't want to go to grad school to study Plato and be another philosopher. I didn't want to do that. So I changed my major back to psychology, and I was like, I genuinely enjoy studying human behavior. Maybe something will just work itself out later. I kept studying psychology. Still told everybody that I wanted to be a therapist. I was working for the Rape Crisis Center. Basically, that was the first thing I started doing when I went to college. So I was 18, maybe 19 years old when I started working there. I did what's called victims advocacy, which for people that I'm just giving the really long story short, I just say it's like crisis counseling, but for rape victims. And a little bit of that is involved, mental health crisis counseling, but most of the time what I did was a mix of legal advocacy and victims advocacy. The problem is that I got really, really burned out because it's very draining work. I was going to college full time. I had to work most of the time, at least 2 jobs just to, support myself. And then I was doing this really, really emotional work with people. You see them in the worst moment of their lives consistently. I did a lot of other activism with sexual violence awareness and fundraising and stuff like that. So I started working with this charity event called Walk a Mile in Her Shoes. And it's where you ask cis men, presumably, to wear bright red heels and literally walk a mile in women's shoes. And, of course, they have to pay for tickets and it raises a lot of money. Every year we would raise $2,000 or $3,000 for the Rape Crisis Center, which is a lot in rural Georgia, which is where the school was, Georgia Southern. I met this professor there who studied victimology. It was her first year, and I was totally fascinated by the fact that somebody would do that. Because keep in mind, I was a psychology major. I was surrounded by people who either were therapists or they did experiments. When I learned that there were people who study victims and crime victims, I was like, that's really fucking cool. And, I told her I don't know what to do with my life. I graduate in like a year and a half at the point that I met her. And she said, well, stay at Georgia Southern and do our criminal justice master's degree. It wasn't really a master's in criminal justice. It was a social science master's degree with an emphasis in criminal justice. And so I said, okay, whatever. I don't have a better plan. So, they offered me funding and everything and I did it. But the whole time it was kind of like impulsive, right? I didn't really have a reason to be doing any of this stuff. I just sort of did it because she told me to. And I'm still working at the Rape Crisis Center because at that point it's like ingrained in my life. Like I worked really closely with all these people. I would go out with drinks with them. I wouldn't have known what to do if I had stopped working for the Rape Crisis Center. So I was very, very burned out. I was finishing my master's degree. I had the same crisis again. Well, now I'm going to have a master's degree. And I don't know what to do. It was on something totally unrelated to me. I was studying foster children. That's what my master's thesis is on, the foster system. So I get this call at 11 o'clock at night, midnight, in the midst of my like existential crisis. And it was a police officer on the other line saying, there's a client or a victim or whatever they said, and you need to come to the hospital emergency room. I had never had a call like that. It was always the clinic, and before we had our own building, it was like a little doctor's office that volunteered us. I had never had a call that required us to go to the hospital, and I had especially never had a call like that after we had our own clinic. So in my mind, I was preparing for, okay, something really terrible happened, and that's why I have to go to the emergency room. And so I asked the police officer, I was like, okay, well, what do I do when I get there? And the officer was like, just go up to the desk, tell them who you are, they'll help you out. And I was like, okay, whatever. Well, keep in mind, I'm like 22, 23 years old. This was a volunteer job. Like, it's not like I wore business casual or whatever. I was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. I didn't have a badge. I didn't have anything that made me look important. So I remember I was like, I got to make myself look legitimate somehow. I'm going to look like a crazy 22-year-old coming into the ER for nothing. So I brought my manual. It's in a thick black binder. I was like, I need something to make myself. So here I am. It's like 11 o'clock at night, midnight. I walk into this ER and I probably look extremely out of place. I walk out to the desk and I'm like, I'm the victim's advocate. There was a sexual assault case, I guess, and I'm supposed to be back with the victim or whatever. I expected her to the nurse to drill me with all these questions and put me through hoops. And she said, okay, go through that door, pick up that phone, ask for the nurse's station, and they'll tell you what to do from there. And I said, okay. So I walked through the door. I picked up the phone. I said, I need to go to the nurse's station. I'm the victim's advocate. I started to over explain. They were like, okay, just keep going down the hall, turn right, blah, blah, blah. I was like, okay. So I'm alone in the back of the hospital, the magical place that I only ever saw in Grey's Anatomy. And I made my way to the nurse's station. Nobody said anything to me. Nobody acknowledged me, really. Doctors and nurses were walking by. So I get to the area I was supposed to be, and I see a detective standing there. And I figured that was where I was supposed to be. The way this ER was laid out, there wasn't really a whole lot of privacy. There was, beds in the middle of the floor separated by curtains that would be drawn back. The detective said, introduced herself. I introduced myself. She said, okay, well, the victim is right behind those curtains. And I talked to her a little bit, but I was going to let you talk to her more before I talked again. I said, okay, which is normal as well, So again, I'm preparing myself for the worst because I'm like, why the fuck are we in an ER? And I walk up to the curtain and I pull it back, and there's this girl sitting on the bed, crisscross, and she has She has long brown hair and it's like flipped over so I can't see her face. She's got a cell phone in her hand. So when I pull back the curtain, she like looks up to me and flips her hair up. I almost had a heart attack because she looked almost exactly like one of my ex-girlfriends at the time. Now, it's not that I couldn't tell them apart. It was just this like flash in my mind of this ex that I had had. It wasn't even really about like gaydar or anything like that. None of that was going off. It was a flash in my memory. It kind of set me off balance, but I introduced myself anyway to her. When I said, I'm the victim's advocate, this is what I do, this is my job, I started to tell her some other stuff and she totally interrupted me. And she said, are you a lesbian? And, you know, I just kind of paused for a minute, probably an uncomfortable amount of time, and I looked at her. Flash all the way back to, I'm 18, 19 years old, and I'm being trained as a victim's advocate. And it was like a multiple part training. There was like an online portion, there was an in-person portion, there was a hands-on portion. And this was towards the very end of the training. There's like 15 of us being trained. We're all in a room. The executive director gave us these scenarios. And, she was like, here's what you would do, or what should you do if you were in this scenario. We're supposed to work it out. And there were mostly women in the room, except for one man who was like sitting at a table alone on the other side of the room. And I remember the executive director talking to him at great length about the possibility that a victim would not want to talk to him because he was a man. I mean, the director was going on, and like he was asking questions, and it was this big thing, like, and I just remember sitting in that room feeling so awkward and so uncomfortable because I was, I didn't have short hair like this. I used to have long hair, but I was still wear it in a ponytail and wear men's clothing and get misgendered constantly. I mean, I had issues that a lot of queer people have with going to public restrooms and having people say shit to you and whatnot. So I just remember she's having this conversation with this presumably cis man in the room, and going on and on about how there always needs to be a female advocate on backup when he's on call, and how he always has to take the initiative to ask, do you want a female advocate? And making that really clear. And I just remember feeling so uncomfortable in the room because I was like, if you follow the logic as to why a victim would want a female advocate, well, it's fear logic. So there really isn't much rational thought there. It's a response to fear and trauma and stress, and has nothing to do with him personally. It's something to do with fear, really. And so if it's fear logic that we're using, it's not really clear if it's men or masculinity or something about him that would trigger that fear. So I was like, could it apply to me? Because people don't look at me and say, that's a woman, the essence of femaleness right there. And so I didn't know. I didn't know if that would ever happen to me, if anybody would ever, but the executive director never said anything to me about it. And no one ever brought it up to me. And in the whole 6-ish years that I did rape crisis victims advocacy or whatever, no one ever said anything to me. So flash back forward to that night that I'm talking to that girl and she interrupts me and she says, are you a lesbian? All I could think about was that moment in that room where I worried about that. And I was like, shit, this is my moment. This is the moment that I worried about for almost 6 years.
What were you worried about specifically?
That she would be uncomfortable with a lesbian advocate. That generalized fear that some victims have of masculinity. Well, I had lots of essences of masculinity in me. So I was like, maybe she wouldn't want to work with me because of that, right? I paused for a really long time, probably, with that question. I thought to myself, okay, well, I should just be honest with her, and if she has a problem with it, I guess I'll call the executive director. I had her personal number at that point. And so I said, yeah, I am, but I can get you a new advocate. I can get you, there's somebody on backup. There wasn't anybody on backup. In fact, the only reason I was on call that night was because the executive director was out of town on a conference, and the advocate who was supposed to pick up the phone did not pick up the phone. I picked up the phone because I was on backup for the executive director who was on backup. So there was nobody. I was the end of the line. But I told her anyway, I was like, I'll find somebody else to do this. Like, it's not a big deal. You just tell me what you need, because it's not about me. It was about her. And she was like, no, that's not what I meant. I meant that I'm glad. And I remember her saying, thank God, because I was so worried that what had happened to me would somehow make me straight. I think it's fear logic. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but in a way it kind of does, because, I think she was dealing with more complex issues with her sexuality, and when it's this type of crime, like a very identity charged crime, it fucks with your mind, I think, is what that came down to. That was a moment that I had never prepared for, to actually have to talk to a victim who would have really complex feelings because of their sexuality or their sexual orientation or something like that. But at least I could understand her because I was on the same brainwave, so to speak. So we worked through a lot of those feelings and, went through the case as normal, which was a terrible case from the start. But I remember going home that night and sort of having a crisis over it because, I had been very burned out. I didn't even really want to pick up the phone and go on that call. I was like the backup's backup. And I didn't expect that call. I wasn't mentally prepared for it. I didn't want to go to it. And then it turned out to be this really difficult, complex case with the only lesbian victim that I had ever dealt with in the whole 6 years that I was there. I remember doing the math on it later and figuring out what got to me about that case and realizing that, lots of people don't report sexual violence. In fact, it's probably the most underreported crime in the whole country. And LGBTQ people broadly generally do not report crimes that happen to them, especially. And people who do victims advocacy are generally older white women who are retired and are doing it for other reasons. And so it just so happened that out of the less than 5% population of the world that's gay or lesbian or bi or trans or whatever, she happened to actually be victimized and call the crisis line and go through the process and end up at the hospital. And I happened to be the one that took the call, despite being on triple backup. And I was like, if I wasn't there, that case would have had a very different outcome for her. It's not like I could have affected the actual legal outcome of the case, but for her mental health, it would have been very, very different if she had had one of the old white women that also worked for the Rape Crisis Center. I finished my master's thesis on the foster system because I was already almost done with it at that point. But it really just set me on this path forever because I was like, what other parts of the criminal justice system don't work for LGBTQ people? What kinds of services do we not have access to? And how is the system sort of flawed when it comes to addressing LGBTQ queer people's needs in general? That case really, really was a defining moment. That night really, really was a defining moment. And it really just got me into thinking about stuff like that, like queer people having to use services that weren't made for them, that weren't designed for them, that were made by people who are totally unlike them. And I mean, what are you supposed to do? What if she had got, the question I always asked myself was, what if she had gotten the advocate that she was supposed to get that night? Even if she had gotten the executive director, who's right now one of, my best friends, but the executive director was still a straight woman. The advocate who was supposed to be on call was still a straight older woman. So what if she had gotten one of those advocates that would have been very confused by that feeling? She probably wouldn't even said it. She probably would have had a different mental health outcome in that situation. And unfortunately, that's what happens to most queer people who try to access victim services or really any services in the criminal justice system. Is it's not made for them. The very first class I took the first semester of the PhD program was a qualitative methods course. And at the PhD level, it was all about like some strategies for interviewing people and, doing things like ethnographies, which is where you like go live and be a part of whatever it is you're trying to study, stuff like that. And we actually had to do interviews. Now, the point was all about the technique and not about doing perfect science or whatever. So the professor told us to just interview people who were stigmatized and talk about it, do an interview, do research or try. So we didn't have a lot of time, and it takes a long time to recruit people for this stuff. And so I said, well, now's my chance to experiment with some of these ideas that I had. I'm going to interview queer people. So I Facebook messaged some friends. I was like, I have this stupid project I need to do. Can I interview you and ask you some questions about stigma? For the most part, they all said, sure, why not? And one person was a trans man who also went to the same school as me in rural Georgia. He told me this story that really, stuck with me when, really influenced my... I was already thinking about queer people trying to access services in the criminal justice system and living in a world that wasn't meant for them, that wasn't made for them, I guess I should say. And the basic story was that he had a roommate, a non-binary person, a roommate, and the guy that I interviewed, the trans man, came home from work one day and thought somebody was breaking into his house because the front door was open and some shit had been moved around. It really looked like somebody broke into his house. And so he called the police, which I think is what the average person would do if they thought somebody was literally in the process of breaking into his house. He thought his roommate was at work. So the police come down, they look around, and they figure out that it's his roommate had actually come home from work. And the roommate lost their keys. So they came in through the window and left the door open. It was a total misunderstanding. Nobody communicated with each other. It was a bizarre situation. Well, the police took the ID of the trans man, the driver's license of the trans man, probably for, police reasons, and the gender marker hadn't been changed yet. Then the police started questioning him. They said, so you called us out here to a crime that wasn't happening, that wasn't a crime, and it was this bizarre situation with your roommate, and now your ID is actually incorrect. You don't look like this person on this license, and your gender marker doesn't match it. Are you trying to protect somebody? Is something going on? They actually took him to the police station and questioned him, and in my mind, looking back, I don't really remember how what I said in the interview or what I thought or whatever. But looking back on it now, that's just the perfect example of the criminal justice system not being made by people who understand queer people, right? Because if it was any other person, if it was a cis woman, a cis white woman who called the police, I think somebody's breaking into my house, and the police came down, they saw it was nothing, everybody would have a good laugh, the police would say, better safe than sorry, and they'd leave. But because his gender marker didn't match his driver's license, and because his picture didn't look like his driver's license, he looked more masculine, it turned into this big thing, and it didn't make any sense. It really was the roommate locked themselves out, and you know what I mean? It was a normal misunderstanding.
That's fucking terrifying. God.
And it's interesting that you would have that reaction, because the other thing is I kept interviewing people. I'm interviewing all my friends for my class at this point, and everybody knew that story. Even people who didn't know them directly knew that story. It was this reverberation from person to person, and it created so much fear, that when I explain it to cis people, when I explain it to my advisor, I said, I want to do this for, work, for life. I want to study this stuff. She didn't have that reaction. She was like, yeah, that's pretty interesting. Fear of the police. That's a good buzzword in criminology. But cis people don't have that. That's scary because that could be me reaction that I just heard from you.
And so we need data, right? We need to know specifics. We need to know who's impacted and how before we can eventually figure out a way to fix it. So enter the field of queer criminology.
Queer criminology is sort of a new-ish field relative to the whole of criminology, but it comes from this idea of critical thought, which is an umbrella term that a lot of people use to reference a lot of different far out or leftist or whatever perspectives they want to call it. So depending on who you ask, they might actually give you a different answer to the question, what is critical thought? But I think everybody would loosely sort of say the same thing, that it comes from Marxist ideas of inequality. The thing with Marx's ideas was that they were meant to explain political or economic inequality, actually mainly economic inequality. Marx said, in short, I'm summarizing this great philosopher with 2 sentences, but in short, Marx said that those who hold all of the resources in society hold all of the power, and that affects the rest of society and the way that those without power interact with those in power and vice versa. This is the example that I give my students. I give them the example of extra credit. Now, I have a class with 50-ish people in it, and I'll stand in the front of the room and I'll say, I have 10 extra credit points that I'm willing to give. I just haven't decided how I'm going to disperse these points, so I'm going to let you guys work it out. So I have 10 extra credit points, and I'd like you to figure out what I'm going to do with them. What happens is people start throwing out suggestions to you. They say, you could give them to the people who work the hardest. And then somebody inevitably says, if they worked really hard, they're probably not going to need them. And then somebody else says, okay, well, let's give it to the people who need it the most. And somebody else says, well, what if they didn't work very hard and they're super failing the class? 10 points not going to help them anyway, and it's not fair to the people who worked hard. And then somebody else will say, okay, what if we give them to the people who are really close to passing and they only need 1 point? Then you could help 10 people who are really close to passing. And then somebody else is like, well, what if it would get them from a B to an A, and that would affect their GPA and their chances at a scholarship? And it's all this what ifs. They go on and on and on and on. And I let them, and then I eventually cut them off. And I say, but do you really have any say in what happens with these points? And they're like, yeah, you just gave me an option. And I'm like, but do you really have any say? Do I have to give you those points? And they're like, I guess not. Because, they don't. As the instructor of a class, I don't even have to give extra credit points. And 10 is an arbitrary number. I could give them all 10 points. Nobody, somebody might say, don't do that if they don't deserve it. But for the most part, I can do whatever I want because points are socially constructed. I get to design how many points are in the class. What if my class is worth 1,000 points? 10 points is nothing. 1 point is nothing. What if my class is worth 100 points? 10 points is a lot of points. The reality is I'm giving them the illusion of having a choice by having them sit there and discuss it. But the choice is really mine because I'm the one in power in that situation. And I think that example is really illustrative of Marxist or critical thought because it can apply in a variety of other situations, right? The rules that we have that govern our society are totally socially constructed by one specific group of people. And that's where queer criminology comes in. All the critical theorists, feminist theorists are a really good example of critical theorists. So pop quiz, feminist theorists say those who hold all the resources hold all the power. In feminist thought, who is it that holds all the power then? It's men, right? So queer criminologists, similar on that line of thought, similarly, they say those who have all the resources hold all the power. And those who have all the resources are cisgender heterosexual people. So everything in our society is constructed by cisgender heterosexual people. And in criminology, everything has been constructed by cisgender heterosexual people. I mean, specifically cisgender heterosexual white men. I mean, I tell my students this all the time and they laugh and they're like, oh, that's funny. I'm like, no, really though. The way science works, I don't know if people think you just stand in a lab and you shake beakers and you go, but the way social science and human behavior works, or the study of human behavior works, is you have somebody sit down at a desk and say, that sounds like a problem, and they think it through and they write some papers on it. And for most of the history of criminology, that person who's been sitting at that desk thinking through those problems have been cisgender heterosexual white men. So when it comes to something that like I'm interested in, like victim services, they were probably intended for like white women, sexual assault services. So when you have a trans man come through, or when you have a black guy coming through, or a gay guy coming through, or a lesbian coming through, it's not that they would be totally useless for that person, but it just wasn't really meant for them. It's like wearing clothes that aren't your size. Like you could wear them, just wouldn't really fit right. It wouldn't be the best experience for anybody around you or for you. That's why I'm so passionately interested in queer criminology, because critical theory is best at asking questions about the status quo, about asking questions and finding flaws in mainstream thought. I'm interested in a lot of different things as it relates to this research. Like, people who get PhDs in criminal justice tend to do one of two things. They either go into academia, where they do more research and they present these findings at conferences to other professionals, or they go on to do like applied work. Like they'll work for a research institute or a nonprofit or something like that, or maybe work for the federal government. And, well, I'm really into research, period. So applied work is not really something that interests me. Like maybe one day I'll want to go work for a nonprofit or something like that, but right now it's not something that's at the front of my mind. What I'm really interested in is sort of laying that foundation in the field of criminology for queer people. And there's this whole branch of criminology called queer criminology. And there's not many people who study it, obviously, and you can guess that they're probably all queer themselves for the most part. And, it's like a handful of us. I chat with them at conferences every now and then. Everybody does really great research. And as far as I'm concerned, the most important thing to me is to be somebody who really relates to these issues and can understand them and present them in an accessible way to cis people, the majority group, to cis heterosexual people, and think about things differently. Cis people don't really think about queer things the same way. I mean, in queer criminology, the best studies that have been published have been by other people who were also queer, or who were so deeply invested in queer people that their work just reflected that. It's, it's something different, a different approach to it. So that's where I'm at. And I also make it a point to discuss queer issues basically in every space. I probably sound like a broken record, like, oh, there's that queer person talking about queer people again. But I mean, I think that's important. Every class that I teach, every group of people that I meet, I make it a point to, here's my identity, here's why I do this, and here's why you should give a damn, even though you probably don't know any queer person, and you're going to go be a cop with your bachelor's degree in criminal justice.
Shanna, thank you for the important work that you do. Thanks for taking the time to share it with us. If you want to know more about queer criminology, there are links in the show notes to lots of things you can check out. Shanna is currently recruiting people for her research. She's interested in talking to anyone who identifies as transgender or gender nonconforming for a 60 to 90 minute interview about experiences and interactions with the criminal justice system. You can reach out to her at shanna.felix@live.com, and that address will be in the show notes as well. If you want to reach out to me, I'm on Twitter and Instagram at CallieGetsIt. If you want to help support the show, please share this episode around to your friends, send text messages, share on your social media. It all helps and it all makes a difference. You can also check out patreon.com/queersplaining. Consider a per episode donation to support the show. You'll get each episode early and you can get access to lots of other content that doesn't make its way onto the main podcast feed. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things, and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, my name is Callie Wright, and this is Queersplaining.